The murder of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul has provided Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan an opportunity to redeem his much tarnished reputation. Here is Erdogan addressing the case of Khashoggi's murder.
Blaming some intelligence members for this matter will satisfy neither us nor the international community. The conscience of humanity will only be satisfied once everybody is called into account, from those who gave the orders to those who carried them out. If that's the case, you are obligated to reveal this local cooperator. You will reveal him. Without these questions being answered, nobody should think the issue will be closed. I told the first delegation that came here about how inadequate the Consul General was, and I reiterated the same things to the king.
Here's the response of Mohammed bin Salman and what he had to say in response to President Erdogan.
First of all, the crime was really painful to all Saudis. And I believe it is painful to every human in the world. It is a heinous crime that cannot be justified. Today, Saudi Arabia is carrying out all legal things to finalize the investigations, to cooperate with the Turkish government, and to present the perpetrators to the court and take their judgment. This is the expected thing that all governments would do once they see a crime. Undoubtedly, the cooperation today between the Saudi and Turkish government is unique, and we know that many are trying to use this painful thing to drive a wedge between Saudi Arabia and Turkey. I want to send them a message. They will not be able to do that as long as there is a king called King Salman bin Abdulaziz. And a crown prince called Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia.
Joining me now to discuss Turkey's role in all of this and Erdogan's grand bargain here is Ilhan Tanir. He is a Turkish journalist based in Washington, D.C. and is the executive editor of Aval News. Tanir was in mid-16 in Washington, D.C. as the reporter for one of Turkey's last independent secular newspapers, the Cumhuriyet Daily. And now he was, of course, targeted by Erdogan along with his editor and 15 other journalists who were all labeled terrorists because they reported against the state. Some of them were jailed and others were hounded into exile. We are very pleased to have you here with us, Ilhan. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Ilhan, you recently wrote in an article in the website BuzzFeed where you argue that Erdogan is successfully manipulating the Khashoggi murder for his own benefit to advance his own profile internationally, which has suffered quite a bit also nationally. So exactly how is it that Erdogan is benefiting from the case of Khashoggi?
Yes, thank you for pointing that out. First of all, I have to say once again, this was a horrible act against journalist Khashoggi. So we are putting this aside, we condemn this, and we want to never see any kind of act similar to this. But what Erdogan gains from this? Erdogan has been dismantling Turkish media for over a decade. Turkey had a very lively media till a couple years ago. Despite his efforts, Turkey still had very media that represented very different segments of Turkish society. Since the coup attempt in 2016, now we have basically 90% of the media in Turkey under the thumb of Mr. Erdogan. And Mr. Erdogan winning in several fronts in this Khashoggi situation. First of all, Mohammed bin Salman and Erdogan have been rivals. Since the coup in Egypt in 2013, Saudis and the Turks are on the opposite side of the regional balance, and the Turkish Qatari wing are under the attack of the Saudi, UAE, Egypt, and some other Gulf countries. Now that Mr. Erdogan leaking this horrible act, every single day he has been undermining Mohammed bin Salman. We know that some of the columnists in Turkey, very close to Mr. Erdogan, argued a couple of days ago that Mohammed bin Salman might stay in as a Saudi ruler for the next 50 years because he's young. So that is why Turkish government is going after him, and he's trying to force him out. Secondly, as a main point, Mr. Erdogan, who has been dismantling Turkish media, jailing hundreds of journalists, which is Turkey, for years now, is the country which jails the most journalists. Right now, there are 176 journalists, and Mr. Erdogan has shut down hundreds of media outlets since 2016. So he could be the latest, last person in the world could be classified as a friendly to the free media. But now, since Khashoggi is a journalist, he and his officials in Ankara are depicting themselves as they are somehow defending journalism or free media, which has nothing to do with what they are doing.
Ilhan, you are particularly placed to critique Erdogan's record on press freedom. You yourself, being a journalist in Turkey, came under his attacks. Tell us about your own experience as a journalist in Turkey and the kind of persecution that journalists experience, not only you, your colleagues, while in Turkey.
Yes, unfortunately, while these Khashoggi leaks happening just last week, exactly a week ago, I woke up in the morning here in Washington, D.C., and suddenly see a local Turkish court in Istanbul decided to ask Interpol to issue red bulletin on me because there's a court case that Mr. Erdogan and his government launched in 2016 against the Cumhuriyet newspaper. I was a correspondent for Cumhuriyet, a secular and independent newspaper of Turkey, one of the very few ones in Turkey now still surviving. Mr. Erdogan already jailed 15 of Cumhuriyet journalists, some of them jailed for 9-10 months, some of them 2 years. And since myself and editor-in-chief, former editor-in-chief Can Dündar was in Germany, they separated our cases. And now apparently they are going to ask Interpol to issue red bulletin. Why? Obviously, journalists, of course, should be held accountable if they are committing crime. When we are looking at the indictment the Turkish court issued for me, about 18-20 pages. And there are my tweets, about 30 of my tweets. I got about 75,000 tweets now. And in those tweets, did I praise terrorism? Did I praise the Gülen movement that Mr. Erdogan classifies as a... You cannot see none of those. Or they accuse me as a PKK, pro-Kurdish terror organization, as a propagandist. Why? Because I gave an interview, Kurdish outlet, that the same outlet, Mr. Brett McGurk, U.S. Special Envoy, gave an interview. So these are the laughable accusations that Mr. Erdogan has been and his government leveling. What they gain from it, like myself, there are many journalists in Turkey. If you are not lucky, if you are in Turkey, you go to jails, you lose your job, and you stop writing. And this is the win for Mr. Erdogan.
Now, these attacks on independent media and also on journalists in specifically, especially the ones you're talking about, has had a tremendous effect in terms of press freedom in the country. Now, how is Erdogan manipulating the situation? We know that after the so-called coup against him, he was able to take greater control of the state media, try to exile as many independent journalists as he could. But he's also expanding his base using the media, and he's gaining a greater profile worldwide using his media. And this Khashoggi case is a case in point. So describe to us how he has used this case of the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in order to advance his own profile in the country as well as obviously globally.
So, first of all, as you pointed out, he has been using his media, especially since 2013 against the protests in Turkey, when a group of people wanted to defend the final green area in the Taksim, in the heart of Istanbul, and that protests spread across Turkey. That is when Mr. Erdogan truly started his war against the critical journalists. Since then, that operation expanded. His media in Turkey, which now he has basically 90% of the media, especially he's in control of state Turkish TVs and news agencies. And as you can guess, these are the entities invested by millions, while other independent media in Turkey are just trying to survive, or they pay very little because even the private enterprises are not allowed to give any kind of ads to these critical outlets, because if they give, then they're under the pressure. Yes, Mr. Erdogan has been using his media operation. His media operation are going after, first of all, critical journalists, and then civil society organizations, and any kind of opposition leaders they've been going after with the powerful intelligence backing behind them. And they used conspiracy theories many times, unfounded and fake news, as we call it now. Actually, Mr. Erdogan's media discovered that conspiracy theories in since the 2013, and they've been using it. In this Khashoggi affair, one of his main rivals in the region apparently made a big mistake, big error, and they gave him basically a free hand, Mr. Erdogan. Whether Mr. Erdogan's intel operations were already tipped off ahead and they start to listening the Saudi consulate, or they were already listening to them and this just randomly they picked up. For whatever the reason, Mr. Erdogan now appears to have moral high ground and appears to have upper hand, because again, it seems like the Saudis did this. They already admitted they killed the Khashoggi, and now apparently they are doing some kind of investigation. And Mr. Erdogan, by using his media and media operations, has been giving these leaks to his own media through his officials. He now appears to be, again, going after some crime, and they are appearing as if They care about journalists. Just one thing I wanted to add, I'm just curious if somebody happens in Istanbul, if there was a Qatari dissident journalist, if something happened to him at the Qatari consulate in Istanbul, how much of that event or crime would have heard without Mr. Erdogan's permission, since Qatar and Turkey very close? There's a question mark.
And finally, Ilhan, what is President Erdogan's ultimate goal in all of this? What is he hoping to achieve?
For the last couple of years, Turkey has been going from one election to another election. There were two general elections and presidential elections, and all of these, Mr. Erdogan used many of the foreign policy issues domestically. And in this process, his severed ties with several EU countries, his relations with EU got worse, his relation with the US, and many other countries in the region. Basically, Mr. Erdogan, yes, he seized, he got what he wanted as a presidential system. He overhauled the whole Turkish system. Now he is the one executive person. Even the Turkish parliament, traditionally, historically, very important part of the Turkish political system, now out of picture, and there is no checks and balances. But in this process, Mr. Erdogan isolated himself, and his economy is doing very badly. Everybody, including very reputable and respected economists, predicting that Mr. Erdogan's country's troubles just starting now. And now I think with this Khashoggi affair, he is making a lot of progress to be integrated again. He released this American pastor just last week, coinciding with the Khashoggi situation. I think what he wants is, again, he wants to be part of the respected statesman. He wants to be part of the Western world. He wants to be part of the international community, and he wants to be able to, again, visit the Western capitals and show off. I think this is what he's gaining right now, as, again, he has the upper hand and higher moral ground due to this heinous, horrible act apparently committed at Saudi consulate in Istanbul.
All right, Ilhan, I thank you so much for joining us today. I've been speaking with journalist in Washington, D.C. He's the editor of Aval News Service. I thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me again.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.